goes. Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And joining me today is Richard Sanders of the Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade. Richard is a Canadian journalist, historian, peace activist, NGO critic, media critic, and some of his incredible muckraking exposés include revealing Canada's secret and not so secret behind-the-scenes role in helping the Anglo-American invasion and occupation of Iraq, Canada's deep imperial involvement in the coup against the democratically elected socialist government of Aristide. Mr. Sanders has done some deep historical investigations into Canada's settler colonial regime and brutal apartheid towards the Indigenous people of Canada, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Canada's brutal internment camps of Ukrainian leftists during World War I. These are just some of his extraordinary stories he's explored, and more with his colleagues, which people can check out at coats.ncf.ca. And we're going to be talking about yes, we're going to be talking about a specific story that he's investigated. But before I get into that, Richard, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you. It's been a while since I've been wanting to be on your program, so thanks very much for having me.
It's an honor to. Likewise, it's an honor to have you. You've been wanting to have you for a long time, ever since I read this historical investigative series you did called Defunding Cold War Canada. So my first question, Richard, then is explain what you uncovered in your historical investigative series Defunding Cold War Canada. And because now from what I understand, reading this series, you expose how so many of these Eastern European expat civil society groups, which of course many which are funded by the Canadian government and its allies, were founded by runaway Nazi war criminals and collaborators, and these same institutions also lionize Nazi war criminals and collaborators. And these are the same groups that not only supported the brutal shock doctrine policies after the fall of the USSR and communism in the Eastern blocs and Russia, but these are also the very same groups that support reactionary far-right movements in Eastern Europe, which and of course lobby many of these countries to want to join NATO, and of course they weaponize anti-Russia, anti-Putin syndrome and keep us trapped in a state of endless hot and cold wars, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good summary. Yeah, so I started off, I guess my first real awareness of this issue about the East European émigré groups in Canada that were, that are still, they represent their ethnic communities, and these associations were, in most cases, they were founded or led, and their main activists were, throughout the Cold War, were these Nazi collaborators, and they were, Holocaust complicity deniers. It's not that they deny the Holocaust so much, but they deny their own community's involvement in it. So one word that I'm not so sure about that you used was runaway. They didn't have to really run. They weren't like hiding, like they didn't have, like the Canadian government wanted these people to bring them over. And the Canadian government brought tens of thousands of people over here from Eastern Europe, probably about 160,000. And I think most of them pretty clearly were anti-Soviet, and many thousands of them were collaborators. And so you had the situation where 2,000 members of the Waffen-SS Galicia, so that's the Ukrainian division of the Waffen-SS, 2,000 or more of those veterans were brought to Canada, and the Canadian government had no problem with that, and the Canadian Jewish Congress and the left-wing Ukrainians in Canada, the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, were very much opposed to this huge influx of these Nazi collaborators. Also, veterans of Bandera, Stepan Bandera, the fascists, Ukrainian fascists. So members of his Ukrainian insurgents army, many veterans from that fascist army were brought over as well. So the way that I found out about, got into this, was I did research on five different examples of mass captivity in Canadian history. So the first big example is the forcing Indigenous people onto reserves and restricting their movement so that they had to stay on these reserves, which was a major problem. Like it restricted all sorts of cultural, economic, religious behaviors, patterns, their economy, their socializing, etc., and then forcing them into the residential schools. But mass captivity. So I looked at the mass captivity of Indigenous people, and then the next example was during the First World War and the first Red Scare. So they rounded up 5,000 or so people, mostly from Eastern Europe, the Canadian government did, and they put them on what the government called concentration camps. They were led by the military, and they forced them into slave labor. And most of these people were Ukrainian, but it wasn't really targeting all Ukrainians across the it wasn't all Ukrainians that they targeted. They had to be living in cities or very close to cities. They were single, they were men, they were unemployed, and what happened, there had been this economic crisis, like a depression, and tens of thousands of these East Europeans were laid off from working on the railway and working in the bush in these work camps. And then they started coming back into the cities, and a lot of them were organizing protests, and they were very left-wing. They were quite well organized, and they were very left-wing, and the government was scared. And there is correspondence showing that the government, that was one of the main reasons why they were rounding up these people. It wasn't just because they were Ukrainians. I mean, Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it didn't want to be. Those people were not loyal to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it wasn't really legitimate to say that that was the reason. Although the government has since recently given $10 million to some right-wing Ukrainian organizations to promote the memory of those concentration camps and the Ukrainians that were put into them. But those people never mentioned anything about the left wing. So in Canada, the Ukrainian communities has a huge divide between the left and the right. They're not all right wing, they're not all left wing. The community used to be really dominated by the left-wing Ukrainians up until the Second World War, and then that was part of the reason why they brought in so many of these right-wing Ukrainians, because the government was really quite nervous about and it had for decades had been repressing the left-wing Ukrainians, banning their organizations, rounding up their leaders, confiscating their community centers, burning their libraries. Like, imagine during the Second World War, the Canadian government was actually burning libraries of left-wing Ukrainians' books. So anyway, that's how I kind of got into it. I learned that there was this huge split between the left and right, and this split has been there for more than 100 years, and I just found that fascinating. And then that's how I really got into it.
And talk to us about before I ask you about the specific groups. Now, is it so? Sort of going back to the first question. So it sort of is. It's not a coincidence then that when when the USSR dissolved and the Eastern Bloc communist states all fell, it's it's not a coincidence then that afterwards what came was basically far right movements, these competing oligarchic parties, and the fact that that so many of these Eastern European nations are now members of NATO, and now we see ourselves in what appears to be an endless hot cold war with Russia, right?
Um, yeah, so I guess when they got their so-called freedom after the destruction of the Soviet Union, people always say, "Oh, the Soviet Union fell." It didn't fall; it was knocked over. It was destroyed.
Yeah,
That was a lot of work went into destroying it. I mean,
yeah,
for decades they were trying to. As soon as the revolution first happened, the Soviet Russia was invaded by like 150, 160,000 troops. And Canada sent troops, the US sent troops, all the Western European countries sent thousands of troops and to try to intervene in the civil war that happened there. Anyway, and then they never stopped trying to destroy this country. Um, and Hitler, of course, saw it as his main enemy, like wanting to destroy the Soviet Union. He failed at that, even with a massive invasion with Operation Barbarossa and the occupying the country and sending like millions of troops there. He didn't manage to destroy it, but
yeah,
NATO managed to destroy it with the help of the elements within those societies in Eastern Europe that had welcomed the Nazis as liberators. When the Nazis invaded, then so many of these right-wing people who embraced the same ideologies as the German fascists had, they had their own fascist movements in those countries. They were everywhere, and of course they were here too, in Canada, and everywhere else in the West had these fascist movements. But so they embraced anti-Semitism, anti-communism. They were largely Christian oriented, white power, kind of racist, xenophobic, ideological movements. And so when finally the Soviet Union fell and they had their freedom, one of the ways that people in those countries expressed their freedom was to start doing what they hadn't been able to do under the Soviet system, and that was to glorify the Nazi collaborators in their own society, people, fascist organizations, guerrilla movements, political groups, etc., that had sympathized with the Nazi forces and had actually helped them. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Or they were very pro-NATO. These people are very pro-NATO. And you mentioned, what sort of Cold War, I think you were mentioning about Cold War policies of Canada that these émigré diaspora organizations supported. And throughout the Cold War, they supported Canadian involvement in US and NATO-led wars. So, for example, the war in Korea, which killed millions of people, they supported that. And the Vietnam War, they supported that. Canada was very deeply involved in the Vietnam War, arming the United States and doing all sorts of espionage assistance to the US to help them in that war. Although it's part of the Canadian mythology. People think, oh, Canada was a safe haven for US draft dodgers that came here, and kind of have this reputation for having been against the Vietnam War. But actually, we sold billions of dollars of weapons, like horrible weapons, napalm and everything, military helicopters and everything in between, to the U.S. to do that, and we had no problem doing that because the Canadian government was totally on board with the Vietnam War and this whole thing about taking in draft dodgers. Well, 40,000 Canadians went to the U.S., joined the U.S. military, and during the Vietnam War, and there was a law against that in Canada. It was illegal to go and join another country's army, but the Canadian government never prosecuted one single Canadian for having gone and joined the U.S. and gone to fight in Vietnam. So
Wow.
that's another example. You know, that's 40. That's I think more than the number of draft dodgers that came over here from the U.S. We sent soldiers to the. I mean, we didn't send them, but I think they were probably aided and abetted in some way by the Canadian military. You know, it might have been a wink, wink, nod, nod, sort of, hey, you know, you can always go and join the U.S. military. We're not going to. You're not going to get in.
That sort of is Canada not wanting to get its hands seen to be dirty. You know, kind of like Canada's secret involvement behind the scenes with the Iraq with the invasion of Iraq, right?
Right, right, yeah. Canada has this huge reputation as, you know, the peaceable kingdom, and people talk about Canadian values, you know, peace, and democracy, and human rights, and justice, and all this stuff that supposedly Canada stands for. Well, it's just so disheartening when you're up against that kind of propaganda. It's one of the biggest obstacles that people in the peace movement and the anti-war movement face. You know, like throughout my almost 40 years of being involved in the peace movement, this is one of the biggest problems that we have, is the Canadians don't even know that we're involved in all these things. Like if the Canadian government, like during the Iraq war, the Canadian government comes out and says, we've decided not to join the Iraq war, and then the media just broadcasts that all over the place, and then everybody just repeats it. Meanwhile, Canada's involved in all sorts of ways. You know, like we were probably like the fourth most complicit country in the world in the Iraq war, but we avoided the attention that we didn't send very many ground troops. We had thousands and thousands of Navy personnel on our warships, escorting U.S. Warships up through the Persian Gulf to do their shock and awe bombardment of Iraq. You know, we were protecting those ships, and we were leading some of the fleets that were going up there. And we had generals, we had Canadian generals who were in charge of tens of thousands of foreign troops that were fighting in Iraq. You know, it was like there were 3 or 4 different Canadian generals that were in top positions in that fight, in that war against Iraq. But somehow you get these huge lies, and then they just get repeated and repeated, and it's impossible to take these lies down. It's really next to impossible. You know, it takes a long time, and then maybe in 100 years from now, maybe it'll be common knowledge that Canada was involved in the Iraq war and all the other things, but it'll be like what's happening now with the residential schools. It's common knowledge now that Canada committed genocide against First Nations, although some people are reluctant to call it genocide, but that's what it was. But still, I mean, it's widely acknowledged now as a fact and a truth, and people are ashamed of Canadian history about that. But so we have to kind of, part of our job, I think, is we have to kind of imagine what it's going to be like in 100 years, and what are they going to look back on? What are we doing now that in some decades in the future, people will look back and say, how the heck could they do that? Like, what were they thinking? They are so regressive for having done that. So we have to point those things out now that are happening right now, and not so, because we can't wait another 100 years. We're all going to be dead in 100 years.
And of course going back to Eastern Europe and how and you know how this propaganda is allowed to you know, manifest itself. Talk to us about some of these Eastern European expat groups and their founders. Talk to us about the Estonian World Congress, the Latvian World Congress, the World Federation of Free Latvians, the Slovak World Congress, and their Czechoslovak, Polish, and Lithuanian counter.
That would take me a long time to go through all those organizations, but I did document all that. It started off, the magazine started off, or my publication started off, I was just going to look at the Ukrainians. I thought, no, I can't do that. I can't just look at just that one ethnic group. You know, that's not fair. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to look into these other ones, because I didn't know anything about these diaspora émigré organizations and who founded them. I knew basically nothing about them. So I just started from scratch and started digging into it, and I found, sure enough, the founders of all of these organizations and the leaders of them did come over here pretty much right after the Second World War. They were welcomed in, and they had been collaborators with the Nazi cause. Like, for example, I think the first one you might have mentioned was Estonian.
Yeah.
So I just got to refresh my memory here, but there was a guy named where did he go here? Was that the Esto? Okay, so well, actually, with the okay, no, I'd rather. I hope you can edit this out. Can you edit out my floundering?
We can certainly try. We can certainly try.
Okay. Well, okay. The Lithuanian Canadian community. So, yeah. The founder and leader of this organization was Jonas Matulionis.
Yeah.
And he was a banker who was the finance minister of the Nazi puppet regime that was formed in Lithuania during the war. And he was actually, there were two different puppet regimes. The first one didn't last very long. They started to get a little bit critical of the Nazis, and they wanted more independence from the Nazis and to form their own policies. But they were turfed out. But he stayed in, and he remained in this Nazi puppet regime in the second one, and he was their finance minister, and he was basically, he delivered the message to the Jewish community that they had to leave and go into these ghettos, and then those were turned into concentration camps, and then they were shipped off to death camps, and but this sort of pattern repeated itself all through, and that nowadays in Lithuania they have rallies where they glorify the Nazi collaborator leaders as heroes and say, oh, they were freedom fighters and they were great nationalists and that sort of thing. And of course, they demonize anything and everything to do with the Soviet Union, who are considered like the evil empire, the diabolical, horrible people. So they see it as very black and white, and they whitewash their own leaders' complicity in the Holocaust. The Jewish community in the Baltic countries was almost completely annihilated. There's very, very few Jewish people left in the Baltic countries, and it's like ethnic cleansing was a big thing. Like when you're pro a certain nationality or ethnic group, like, so when you say Lithuania for Lithuanians or Ukraine for Ukrainians, or and this sort of slogan is repeated, and they have banners and flags and signs, and it's a slogan, and it's used in marches and rallies. It's not the same as saying a Belgian or a Canadian. We don't, because Canadians are from all sorts of different ethnic groups. You're all Canadians. But to them, what they mean by Ukraine for Ukrainians is that those are different, different ethnicities, the different nations are, for example, Jews and Ukrainians and Poles and Russians. And so when they say Ukraine for Ukrainians, they mean this country is for one ethnic group. And the other ethnic groups are, they are second-class citizens in a way. They're not even real Ukrainians. Like the name of the country is identified with a particular ethnic group. Whereas in Canada, it may have been the case when it was really solidly in the British Empire. That by Canadian you really meant white Western European or something, but anyway, so there's so many details, so many different leaders that I could go through. I'm much more familiar with the Ukrainian community, and that was there. It's the most populous East European group ethnic group in Canada. It's
Well, actually, sorry to interrupt because
yeah,
that's actually a perfect segue then to Ukraine
okay.
yeah, that's perfect segue to Ukraine. But then one quick follow up then is is basically all of these seemingly benign civil society expat groups, which which again were funded by by the Canadian government, like the Estonian World Congress, Latvian World Congress, the World Federation for Free Latvians, the Slovak World Congress, and all of their Czechoslovak, Polish, counterparts. But basically, all of them were, these seemingly benign expat groups were all funded again by, by these Nazi war criminals, Nazi collaborators, right?
Well, they're funded by the Canadian government.
Yeah,
That's what you meant to say, I think. They all received some
funded by the Canadian government, but
right.
founded by these Nazi.
Founded by, yes, founded by, yeah, sorry, I thought, yeah, right. Some more than others, of course, not all of the groups. I didn't find Canadian government funding for all of the groups, but I was sort of just setting the context, saying, okay, look at all these different groups. What are the patterns? Well, the pattern are that their founders and leaders were Nazi collaborators. They glorify their Nazi collaborator heroes from the war, and they kind of whitewash their communities or their forebears' involvement in the Holocaust and other examples of genocide that happened during the Second World War. But the clearest examples of Canadian government funding are for certain Ukrainian organizations that like, for example, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which used to be called the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, so the UCC, and then there's the League of Ukrainian Canadians, which is the main organization that promotes their hero, who was Stepan Bandera. And that League of Ukrainian Canadians has two affiliates. It has its youth affiliate, which is the Ukrainian Youth Association, and it's a scouting troop. So they dress in scouting uniforms.
Brown
They march in
shirts.
brown shirts. They're military style uniforms. But I mean, we have those scouting. It was formed after, in likeness to, or it was kind of a copying of the Lord Baden-Powell, who was a British imperialist, and he formed the Boy Scouts in Britain, and it was just like that. And I don't like them either. I don't like the sort of military style of it and the hierarchicalness of it, and but I don't think it to the same degree. Like, if you look at pictures from their community centers and the pictures that they themselves post on their websites, I mean, there are even some that I found where you have these scouting troops marching in formation, carrying photographs of Stetsko, who was Bandera's second-hand man, and he, openly endorsed the Holocaust. He said that he was in favor of bringing German-style methods of eradicating Jews, annihilating Jews, to the Ukraine. If you couldn't, convert them to become Christians, and they wanted to remain Jews, then the best way is to just treat them the same way that the Germans were treating them, like just annihilate them, and use the German methods of annihilating them. And the Bandera organization, there was a huge split between the two fascist within the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was this movement for independence of Ukraine, and it was fighting against the Poles at one time and against the Soviets, and they embraced terrorist tactics of political assassinations. And then in 1940 there was a split, but the split wasn't based on any disagreement over over fascism or anti-Semitism or anti-communism. They all agreed on that. It was just this, it was more had to do with how much are we willing to just go along with the Nazis and have Ukraine as a part of Greater Germany, or do we insist that we have to have our own independent country? And Bandera was much more on that side. He and his movement, which became to dominate the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, they wanted to have their own independent country. And they wanted to be allied with Germany. They liked Germany, their statement about and then when they actually helped and they marched in, and then they declared independence. Well, the Nazis didn't like that, and they actually, for a while there, a couple of years, they actually rounded up the leaders of the Bandera movement. But then they released them, and then the Banderites actually helped to organize and orchestrate, coordinate a union of fascist armies from all across Eastern Europe that would help the Nazis to fight as they were being chased out of the Soviet Union, because the Germans lost the massive battle in Stalingrad, and that was a turning point in the war. So they were basically being driven back out of there from that point on. But the Ukrainian Banderite types, who are represented in Canada still to this day by the League of Ukrainian Canadians. If you go to the League of Ukrainian Canadians website, there's a picture of Bandera right on the front page there, and you can click on it and find out what a glorious and great guy he was, and what a great leader he was, and et cetera, et cetera. But he was
there's
major
no, there, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it when you really dig into Bandera. That he really was an out and out Nazi. He wasn't some misguided person who was fighting against I guess incoming Nazi German colonialism and Soviet colonialism. No, the guy was an out and out part of a fascist movement, and so
right.
he collaborated with the Nazis, who later, but because he wanted his own independent fascist Nazi Ukrainian state, that's the only moment in time where he
went
fell
too far.
out with,
that was too far. Yeah. That was a bit of a slap in the face of the Nazis. They couldn't allow that. Although they did allow Croatia to have its own independent fascist state, run by the Ustasha, and also Slovakia had an independent fascist state, run by Hlinka, and he was a Catholic priest, and it was a clerico-fascist Nazi state, and they deported I can't remember how many tens of thousands of Jews to the death camps. All these fascist movements, they were brought together by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian fascist movement was the strongest. It was the most powerful one, and so they had the ability to bring the other ones together. And so they met in the woods in Ukraine, and they had this meeting, and they set up this network of armies from all over Eastern European that helped the Nazis. And then after the war, that movement, they couldn't have armies really anymore, although they did continue to have guerrilla movements in the Soviet Union until at least 1960 that were fighting against the Soviet government and administration. But so they changed their name to the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, but it was basically it was just a carryover or a extension and evolution of, it was just, they basically just changed their name from this network of fascist armies, and it became a political propaganda organization, and they were mobilizing their people to fight against communism and the Soviet Union, and they worked with the CIA and other Western European powers to try to do that. And they existed up until the late 90s. And then there was the World Anti-Communist League as well that was formed in the 70s. And I mentioned that the Banderite Youth Association, the Scouts, there are photos from their government-funded community centers where they're marching in formation, carrying Bandera battle flags, the red and black battle flags, and carrying this picture of Stetsko. And Stetsko was the leader, the president of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations for 40 years, and he was also on the executive of the World Anti-Communist League. The ABN, the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, became a major section of the World Anti-Communist League, which united really extreme anti-communists from around the world. They had fascist military dictators. They had, terrorist organizations. All sorts of politicians as well joined it. It was, for a while, it was led by a U.S. general. Anyway, it's a really fascinating history, and I encourage people to learn more about it. It's not something that most people know very much about, but even yeah, go ahead.
And how did Bandera die? Did just out of curiosity?
He was killed by the Soviet authorities. As I said, they were still leading guerrilla warfare against the Soviet government and blowing things up and killing people. They claim to have killed after the war.
And this after World War II or during World War II?
Yeah, after World War II. After the war was over, the fascists lost, but they stayed fighting in the forests, in the jungle, not the jungles, but in the forests in Ukraine, and they kept fighting against the Soviets as if the war hadn't ended. And they were claiming to have killed thousands of Soviet authorities. I'm not sure who they were killing, but they said they were killing thousands of them in their reports to the CIA and in their newsletters and things like that. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours reading through the publications of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations to hear what they said themselves about what they were doing and what they believed in, and all the different organizations that were involved in it. And it's really it's quite an incredible history.
It is, and that sort of leads me to this question, which is talk to us about how these Ukrainian expat groups, you mentioned the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the influence they have on today's Canadian and Western policy in Ukraine, from the pro-EU Euromaidan protests that saw the U.S., UK, Canada, EU, Germany, and NATO back a coup that in Ukraine that empowered far-right groups like Savboda, the right sector, leading to the tragic civil war that we see in Ukraine.
Yeah, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which was originally its formation was facilitated by the Canadian government in 1940. The Canadian government actually was the leading force in creating this thing in the first place. And part of I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question, but I just wanted to go back to the history of this organization first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, they brought over all of the Canadian government brought in all these Nazi collaborating Ukrainians and sympathizers and supporters, people who saw the Nazis as liberators, and they brought many thousands of them over here after the war. Even though during the war and before the war, Canadian government would not allow Jewish people into the country. And even after the war, it was hard for Jewish people to come into Canada. Canada had Mackenzie King as its prime minister, and he was a notorious anti-Semite, and he also went and met Mussolini in the 1920s, and he met, before he was prime minister, and then when he was prime minister, he went over and had a wonderful meeting with Hitler, and he left these thousands and thousands of pages of in his diaries that he released after his death, and he made them public, and so now they're accessible to everyone to read. And he talks about how he went to met Hitler, and how it was like the best day of his life. Literally, it was his life was all leading to this moment when he would get to meet his hero Hitler, who he's just so proud to call his friend. And he talked about looking into his eyes and seeing Joan of Arc there, and this was a guy who believed our Mackenzie King, our prime minister, who was the most popular Canadian prime minister of all time. He was in there, I think, 5 or 6 times he was elected as prime minister with the Liberal Party. And, he believed in Ouija boards and seances and crystal balls. And like he would have mediums come up from the US to lead him to meet with dead people, his mother, his different relatives. 4 of his dogs, he actually got the medium to communicate with his dead dogs, and he met with various different, Leonardo da Vinci and Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain, and all these dead politicians, everything. The guy was, I don't know, a curious character, but he loved Hitler anyway. And where was I going with this? It was under him that the Ukrainian Canadian Congress was formed, and its purpose was to unify the right wing, because they had just had the split in the Ukrainian movement in Europe, and so they had to bring together the right-wing Ukrainians, and that was part of the reason for forming the UCC. And then also it was designed to bring together the right-wing Ukrainians against the then dominant left-wing Ukrainians, who had been called the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association, UFTA, but then they were banned and leaders were rounded up, and their community centers were all stolen or expropriated by the government, and then sold at rock bottom basement prices, or whatever the term is, really cheap prices. They were sold to the right-wing Ukrainian organizations. Can you imagine? And then burned their libraries and all that. So anyway, the government was really trying as best it could to destroy the left-wing Ukrainian community, which was the most dominant element within the Ukrainian community in Canada. And so they created the UCC. So the UCC has been very close to the Canadian government in the many decades since then, and they've supported the Canadian government and had the ear of the government. I don't think that they really need to convince the government of a lot of things. Like, it's not as if this community, convinced the government to go ahead and, be part of this or that war. They were more like cheerleaders. They were supportive and helpful, and they would lend a hand to whatever they could. And in the media, they would pipe in and say, "Oh yes, we support the government. This or that group, we support the Canadian government for its involvement in these wars." So some of the things that they've done more recently, for example, the Magnitsky Laws. Do you know about the Magnitsky Laws?
Yes.
So
yes.
Okay. So they were big proponents of that, which basically, after the destruction of the Soviet Union, hundreds of billions of dollars of the state-owned assets of the country were basically sold off for ridiculously low prices to foreign corporations. Foreign capitalists went in there and just had a heyday, and they just bought up all the different state enterprises, and so they got away with basically stealing hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Russian government is still trying to contest that theft that happened. And so Magnitsky was involved in creating some kind of a economic scheme for covering that up, and so, but he is venerated as a great hero because he stood up against the Soviets, et cetera, or against Russia, and but in reality, he was working for these foreign capitalists who went in there and raked up all of the state.
Bill Browder, who was he was American turned Russian oligarch, because he realized that because he was taking advantage of the fact that that the Soviet Union was dissolved. There was capitalism on steroids with Yeltsin, so he actually changed his nationality to Russian.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he actually changed his nationality to Russian and was basically like, making like flies with all the assets that they were privatizing and de facto stealing. Magnitsky was his lawyer, who Putin imprisoned when they were looking into and when they were looking into some of his white collar stuff. Alexei Navalny was actually even part of that network,
Oh,
and
okay.
yeah, and then Magnitsky died in prison,
Hmm.
and so the Magnitsky Law is is Canada and the U.S.'s way of targeting Russian corruption and the Russian state, when really it's a tool for them actually helping rival oligarchs, Western-backed rival oligarchs against the government of Putin.
It's
Right?
kind of a economic warfare. You're
Yeah.
you're taking you're using economic sanctions as a way of fighting against your enemy, in this case Russia. So they want to penalize Russia for this or that other thing, so they impose these Magnitsky laws on people, and so that's one of the things that the UCC and other far right, well, there's an organization of East European groups in Canada that had really pushed the Magnitsky laws, and it passed through Parliament a few years ago. And Browder says that Freeland was the kind of moral force or something behind the Magnitsky laws, behind creating them in Canada, at least, if not internationally. That's one of the things, and sort of a domestic thing, which sort of more symbolic, part of more of a propaganda war, not so concrete a thing as economic warfare with these Magnitsky laws. But another thing that the UCC and other organizations, East European émigré organizations, has been involved with is promoting this monument in Ottawa, not far from where I live here. They call it the Victims of Communism Museum, of a monument, and it's right near Parliament. It's right on the same street as Parliament. It's right across from the National Archives and Library of Canada, and it's a pretty prominent location. They wanted to have it in an even more prominent location, but it was so prominent that a lot of people opposed it just because of the location, although they liked the idea of having an anti-communism monument. I call it an anti-communism monument, which is basically what it is. And it's formed by these same organizations that we've been talking about. From the main core that are promoting this monument are from Eastern Europe, the right-wing elements of those communities. Anyway, that monument is promoting this idea that communism killed 100 million people, and there's anyway. So that's sort of an example of what they have been behind. They launched this thing. They're the main organizers of it, and then they got a government crown corporation to endorse it, and now the government is paying. So the total cost of this monument is $7.5 million, and the government is paying at this point 80% of that total cost. Whereas it's only a short distance from the Holocaust Memorial, Canada's National Holocaust Memorial. Is just a little ways away, and it cost about the same amount.
Yet this monument, and yet this victim of communism memorial is, again, it's lionizing Nazi war criminals, Nazi collaborators are criminals, but yeah, these Nazi war criminals / collaborators, and all of these resistance people that they claim that they're lionizing. No, these are basically like the Estonian, Ukrainian, whatever Eastern European countries, Nazi militias that helped in the that helped in the Holocaust. That's what this victim of communism memorial is lionizing, right?
That's what their main drive is, to demonize demonize communism in general as a movement or as a political ideology, and they want to, oddly enough, they want to equate communism and Nazism. They want to say these are two things, these two systems are equals, and they are like diabolical twins. They are both to blame for the cause of World War II. Like they actually say that Nazism and communism together created World War II. Like you're blaming World War II on the Soviets. I mean, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. The only reason why the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact was because the Soviets had tried to get Britain and France and other countries to join them in an alliance to fight against Nazism. Like Hitler made it super clear in Mein Kampf that he wrote in the 1920s. He wrote it, and it was very clear that this guy is a total anti-communist and that he had his eyes on the Soviet Union. He saw.
He wanted to invade the Soviet Union so that he can create a living space for his Aryan race. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, it was clear that Hitler's biggest enemy was the Soviet Union. The biggest entity, the state that he hated the most was the Soviet Union. He hated Jews, but he conflated, Jews and communists together into one beast, the Judeo-Bolshevik monster. And that's who Hitler was against, was this fabulous beast that was both communist and Jewish, and they were sort of all melted together into this horrible beast. And so that's who they wanted to destroy. So how could anyone think that these two things were the same? I mean, they were the most diametrically opposed enemies probably of world history. They were at opposite ends of the political spectrum. The Soviet Union was a very multicultural entity. Like it had republics or states that were within it that were all different ethnic groups and different languages. It was quite diverse. Whereas what Hitler was trying to do was quite the opposite. It was more like ethnic cleansing, anyway. So they tried to equate the two and blame the Soviets equally as the cause of World War II. But it's quite an acrobatics act to do that, and then it's interesting because these are people whose own founders, organizations who are leading this monument, their founders and leaders and their heroes are Nazi collaborators. But at the same time, they want to make they are not opposed to saying that Nazism was bad, and they say, oh, we're against both. Well, if you're so much against the Nazis, then why was your organization founded by a veteran of the Waffen SS? Why was your organization founded by a banker who was the finance minister in a Nazi puppet regime? How could that be? What's going on here? But it's curious. Like the other day, you asked me, do these people? Maybe you were talking about the Canadian government, but I think you asked I
was talking about members of these civil society groups. Like, do they? Go on with what you were saying.
No. So you were asking me. So do they know about this history, or I think that's what you asked me, right? Or do they not realize that what's going on?
The people that they are lionizing are.
Anyway, so it is kind of tricky to wrap your mind around and try to put yourself into their point of view to try to understand. Like, are they lying? I think what you're saying was, are they basically lying and they don't really know this history, or are they just not aware? Do they not know? And then, of course, there's a whole range of people that are some of them really have no idea of their history. You know, they're brought up in these communities. They're part of the organizations. They're only told one side of the story. They've never read anything from the other side of the story. And the mainstream culture, Canadian culture and mainstream culture in many other Western countries as well, has the same mythologies, the same narratives, the same version of history, the same view of history and ideology, and so they're never exposed to anything other than this one particular view that they've been brought up with. So they might not even know. And then when they're confronted with the truth, with the facts, with sources and details and all the names and organizations and all that information, like what I've put together, what they say is, oh, it's all Russian propaganda. It's just it's the Russians. You know, you can't trust this. It's not true. It's just lies that the Russians have come up with to try to subvert our democracy. Like this, what happened when Freeland, or Chrystia Freeland, who's basically the prime minister in waiting in Canada, you know, she's the deputy prime minister. We've only had 10 deputy prime ministers, and she's the finance minister. She's been anointed to become one day the prime minister of Canada.
And explain to people who may not be familiar with the story, but yeah, explain to people Chrystia Freeland and the Nazi skeletons in her closet, which you've exposed.
Yeah, well, it was through through Facebook that I found out about that her grandfather had been the Nazi propagandist, Ukrainian language propagandist for the Nazis. He was the editor of a newspaper, not only one newspaper, but at least two newspapers, a daily and a weekly. And he ran the office, and he was the chief editor of these papers, and they ran speeches by Hitler and Goebbels and all the rest of them, Himmler, and you know, they promoted the German view of history, and they promoted the German war effort in the Ukrainian language. So he was the chief Ukrainian language news propagandist for the Nazis. That's Chrystia Freeland's mother's father, her maternal grandfather. His name was Michael Chomiak.
And she's involved. And she's involved in the same Ukrainian expat groups that lionize Stepan Bandera. She herself has even participated in these cultural events where they're waving the black and red flag, poster and carry posters of Stepan Bandera and so forth, right?
Well, she actually was brought up within not the Banderite movement, not the Banderite wing of the. So she was in a scouting troop, but not the scouting troop that Bandera, like the Bandera organization, the Ukrainian Youth Association. That's a branch of the League of Ukrainian Canadians that I mentioned. That's the main Bandera cult. Basically in Canada. There were these other Ukrainians. Okay, so during the Second World War in Krakow, which was the capital of German occupied Poland. Okay, they called it the general government, but it was basically occupied Poland. Okay, so the Jews were moved out. They were moved into ghettos and into concentration camps and death camps. Well, who filled their places? Who took their homes? Who took their businesses? Who took their printing presses? Who took their coffee shops? And who filled the space where the Jews and the other enemies of the Nazis, this empty space that was created by getting rid of the enemies of the Nazis? Well, it was the Ukrainians. So they had fled from Ukraine because of the Red Army. So they came and they moved. A lot of them moved west, and they went to Poland. And so this is what happened. So they in Krakow, the Nazi intelligence, the Abwehr, it created a thing called the Ukrainian Central Committee, and it was populated by Ukrainian nationalist leaders from not the Bandera side of the split, but the other side. Because remember, Bandera wanted to set up his own fascist state, and so he was willing to slap the Nazis in the face and say, no, we want our own Nazi. Well, the other wing of the Ukrainian nationalists, who were just as fascist, just as anti-Semitic as the Bandera wing, they were under Melnik. Anyway, so they formed the Ukrainian Central Committee, and its president was a guy named Volodymyr Kubiovich. So he was the president of this UCC, which was also formed in 1940. So Canada formed a UCC in 1940. This is probably just a funny coincidence, but Canada formed the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, and the Nazis, the intelligence, formed the Ukrainian Central Committee. So they both have the same acronym, and they both formed in the same year, and they both brought together the Ukrainian fascists who would support those two governments, the Nazi government. And of course, there's huge differences between Nazi Germany and liberal Canada, even though our prime minister loved Hitler. But as finally, just before the war started, Mackenzie King realized that it was a sort of a mistake to have loved this guy so much and thought he was such a great prospect for promoting world peace, which is what Mackenzie King thought. So anyway, Kubiovich was the president of that UCC in Krakow, and he was also the president of the Ukrainian publishing house. And it was the Ukrainian publishing house that published books and magazines and all sorts of different kinds of literature, and they also produced newspapers. And so Freeland's grandfather was the staff, he was the office leader and the chief editor under that organization. Okay, so then after the war, Kubiovich, who was the president of that UCC, he created he had a brainchild, like he created a project. And what his project was the Encyclopedia of Ukraine. So this was a encyclopedic project to memorialize history and to remember history and to canonize it, into a body of literature, this encyclopedia that would this is the way we want history to be remembered. This is the chief collaborator with the Nazis during the whole war, who Freeland's grandfather worked under. That was her boss. Her grandfather's boss was this guy. Okay, so after the war, he starts an encyclopedia. In the 1970s, Freeland's grandfather, who's now living in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, and he's still writing for Ukrainian newspapers. He was a journalist during the war, and then he continued his journalism after the war, and he went and moved to France for a while to live with Kubiovich to work on this encyclopedia. And soon thereafter, Kubiovich comes over to Canada, meets with the people at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, where Chomiak lived, and they sign a contract so that the Encyclopedia of Ukraine would be, the English version of it would be published by the Institute of Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Alberta. So it's a government-funded institute, that academic thing, and that it publishes this encyclopedia that was started and edited by the chief Nazi collaborator for the Ukrainian community in Europe, the right-wing Ukrainian community in Europe. So Freeland gets a job when she's 16, a government-funded summer job working for the encyclopedia that her grandfather had previously worked for the decade before. So she got a job in doing that in the 80s. She had 2 summer jobs working for this encyclopedia. She also worked on Ukrainian News, which was a Ukrainian language Catholic newspaper in Edmonton that her grandfather had been a reporter for, and he became the editor for it in the early 70s. Well, in the 80s, she got a job working there. So there's two Ukrainian right-wing nationalist publications that Chrystia Freeland, our deputy prime minister, now anointed to be the next prime minister of Canada, if our prime minister ever bows out, then there'll be a leadership race, and she'll be one of the top contenders in it, and she may well become future Prime Minister of Canada. But 2 or 3 days ago, the Globe and Mail, which is a big business newspaper in Canada, it published a story about the KGB files that this professor in the US has just dug out of the archives, and it talks about her. They had a code name for her, and they had great respect for her as an incredible, she was only 20 years old, but 20 years old, 30 years ago, when she was an exchange student in Ukraine, speaking perfect Ukrainian. Like, her reason to be there was to learn Ukrainian. Well, she was already fluent in Ukrainian, so she had no need to learn Ukrainian. Her purpose for being there, most of the time that she spent there, was working in organizations, political organizations that were struggling to influence the elections that were there. So the Soviet Ukrainian elections, and she was trying to meddle in those elections. So she's a foreigner. Imagine if some Russian or some Soviet, some communist person came over to Canada and was joining all these organizations, not just joining them, but leading them and becoming the editor of their newspapers and speaking out at meetings and going on TV and her pick. So the KGB were understandably concerned that this foreigner, whose grandfather was, I presume they knew who he was. Anyway, they put pictures of her in the official newspapers and called her a Banderite enemy of the Soviet people. That's what they called her, Banderite enemy of the Soviet people, even though her background, I don't think she was Banderite. She's from the other wing. She's from the wing that really collaborated with the Nazis, whereas the Bandera types were not so keen on that. They wanted their own state. Anyway, so she went on to work for the CIA created Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. It's called Radio Liberty now, but when it was first formed, it was called Radio Liberation from Bolshevism. That's what it was called. And it was, for 20 years, it was created by the CIA, and it was funded by the CIA. And then eventually this came out. It was pretty obvious to some people that, oh, this is a CIA creature, this radio thing. And it was beaming messages at the Soviet Union and into Eastern Europe. And they helped promote Chrystia Freeland. So when she did an interview with a leading Ukrainian separatist nationalist type, then it was published as in a book, and it was published in journals, and her interview with him was promoted by this entity, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which had been created and funded by the CIA for 20 years when it first came on the scene right after World War II, and it used a lot of Ukrainians who were former Nazi collaborators who helped in the broadcasts and beaming propaganda at the Soviet Union. Anyway, sorry, I really have a tendency.
And then no surprise then that this woman, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, who comes from this background, no surprise then that that Canada is lobbying for more Eastern European countries to join NATO, more spending of NATO members on to do more NATO actions, as well as supporting the NATO, the EU, Canadian, UK, US, German backed coup in Ukraine that overthrew. Let me just get their names right. That overthrew, I think, Viktor Yanukovych and installed Petro Poroshenko, and of course the civil war in Ukraine, right?
In 2014. Yeah, that's the Orange. The Orange Revolution was that was earlier. That was 10 years earlier in 2004. Yeah. But Canada was also really involved in that as well, in the Europe and the EU and NATO and all that were also involved in that. So yeah, Freeland, who was also the foreign affairs minister, she promoted this. Before that, she was the economic. She was She was head of some economic related ministry, and she was banned from the Soviet Union, along with when she was banned, or not from the Soviet Union, from Russia. She had been banned from the Soviet Union, but just not too long ago, since she became an MP, she was banned from Russia because of her promotion of this sort of economic warfare against Russia. And so she has a long history going back 30 years to fighting the Kremlin-led people that she has such problems with. You could say she inherited this point of view, not just from her grandfather and her mother, but also her community, from the different organizations that she was brought up in, the Ukrainian schools that she went to. There were so many influences on her life, just as there are in many other people's lives. They're influenced by their church. She used to go to church with her grandfather. Her mother said, "You have to go to church." Look, this is according to what
Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or
no, Catholic, the Catholic Church, Ukrainian Catholic.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so both the Ukrainian Catholic and the Ukrainian Orthodox churches recruited for the Nazi fascist cause during World War II. In fact,
okay, thanks for clarifying that.
The Ukrainian Waffen SS, the Waffen SS Galicia, which was armed and financed, trained by the Nazis, they were led by Himmler, who was the leader of their legion, of their division of the SS. They're all volunteers. They had to make an oath to fight to the death for Hitler and to promote the Nazi cause. So the churches recruited people to join up, and Nazi Germany gave a special privilege to the churches in Ukraine that they didn't give to the other legions, because there was other legions in the Baltic countries and other East European ethnic groups had legions as well, Waffen SS divisions, but only the Ukrainian division allowed chaplains to come in. Ukrainian chaplains were able to go out with the troops and to keep them, to do what, to cater to their religious needs, I guess, as they were waging war.
One of the big oligarchs that has co-opted much of the left and has and supports the Obamas of the world, the Clintons of the world, the Justin Trudeau's, and the Chrystia Freelands of the world is George Soros. But now George Soros is of a Hungarian Jewish background, and I know many of his NGOs supported the pro-EU color revolution in Ukraine, which later became a brutal right-wing putsch leading to the tragic civil war that we see right now in Ukraine. Now, but why would Soros be supporting all of these NGOs which propped up Savboda and the right sector when they lionize Nazi war criminals, Stepan Bandera, a very anti-Semitic, and I'm pretty sure many of them probably use very anti-Semitic arguments towards Mr. Soros himself, because many of our American, Canadian right-wingers, they like to say that, George Soros is shoving cultural Marxism down down our throats. And Viktor Orban uses a lot of kind of uses that language when he says that Soros is meddling in our country. So why would my question is, why would Soros, who supports the Justin Trudeau Freeland regime, why would he support these very reactionary movements in Ukraine who lionize the very people that that wanted to see his people extinguished?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think it has to do with anti-communism. Like, so I think he's pretty hardcore anti-communist. So he doesn't want to see any communist regime anywhere. He's pro-NATO. He's anti-communist. One thing to keep in mind is that I remember I mentioned the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
Yes.
Or it was called Radio Liberation from Bolshevism eventually, but they just shortened it to get rid of the Bolshevism part because that sounds a bit embarrassing, because that's the term that the Nazis always used.
Which unfortunately is actually quite popular amongst English-speaking communities across Western Europe. Many people I know, tune into Radio Free Europe and.
Oh yeah, well anyway, Radio Free Europe, which, as I mentioned, it was created by the CIA and funded by the CIA until it became so obvious that it was a CIA thing that it was outed, and I think some U.S. congressman said, hey, this thing is actually funded by the CIA. And so then it became common knowledge that this was a CIA front propaganda outlet. And so soon after, for a while, it was funded by other U.S. government departments, and now it's been privatized. And guess who has taken over the funding largely of this once CIA thing? It's George Soros's foundations. They're the ones paying for this now. So the Open Society?
Yeah, Open Society's Foundation, I believe.
Open Society's Foundation, yes. So George Soros is behind that, and his foundations took over the funding of this thing that used to be CIA. Now, I should mention, and you probably know this, maybe you're prompting me to say this, but Freeland met with Soros when she was meddling over there. Remember, we said 30 years ago, when she was 20, she was meddling in the Soviet Ukrainian elections. Well, while she was over there, she told the Walrus magazine that in an interview that one day she, just by chance, happened to meet George Soros in Ukraine. She was over there, and or coordinating this movement against, in favor of Ukrainian independence from the Soviet Union, which was the major wedge that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was the Ukraine splitting and then the other states split. And it was a major sort of stepping stone in the final destruction of the Soviet Union. So she was over there doing that, doing her best to help with that. And she just had this chance meeting. Like, do you ever have a chance meeting with a billionaire? Have you ever just happened to meet a billionaire? You're just going to get a cup of coffee or something, or you're walking down the street and, hey, there's a billionaire, hey, and then they come over and they talk to you and they get your advice. And basically, she says he was the wisest man that she'd ever met to that point in her life, And since then, there's lots of pictures of her meeting with him at different times, interviewing him, and she introduced him to Justin Trudeau. And anyway, so he was picking her brain about which organizations and people because he wanted to help fund this movement in the Ukraine. It was still part of the Soviet Union, but he wanted to help fund this independence movement, this nationalist movement. And so he turned to her and he asked her for advice on who he could help fund. And she was just, in awe of when she met him. And so I thought that was kind of curious that she would have this chance meeting with him and that he would pick her brains about she was such an expert. She's 20 years old and she's already an expert. And George Soros is asking her for advice on who to, and then it's interesting because then she's banned from the Soviet Union. because they found these documents in her suitcase. She went off to Western Europe and then came back into the Soviet Union, and then they looked through her suitcase or backpack or whatever, her luggage, and they found some like sort of how-to books on how to subvert elections or something, how to help, basically, you know, what to do in order to win the election. Like, she had these influential, very important kind of documents or sort of books, manuals on how they could, that she was going to then spread around to the movement over there. So they just basically kicked her out at that point. Then she comes back to Canada, and then there's a flurry of newspaper articles lionizing her for having stood up to the KGB, you know, and it's talking. And so who came out in support of her? The mass media did. They promoted her. She's this 20-year-old kid coming back, and she's reporting on how, you know, she'd been up against the KGB and this huge struggle that she had with the KGB. The way they described it was, they asked her to go in for an interview. She said no, and that was that. And then they followed her around and stuff. But basically, the dreaded KGB, they just asked her to come in for an interview, and then she just said no. I mean, she said no, and then she just carried on her work.
And so so Soros can and so oligarchs like George Soros can overlook Chrystia Freeland's background, the kind of community she was part of, and the Nazi skeletons in her closet, because it doesn't matter. Anti-Semitism is out of fashion, but what can still unite us all is anti-communism, fundamentalism, and anti-anything to the left of Aristide or Bernie Sanders in Eastern Europe.
Right. Well, I mean, look at Venezuela. What happened there? Freeland was one of the key people in the Lima group, which was this multilateral entity representing the governments of various different South American, Caribbean countries that wanted to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela, which just happened to be a socialist government and a bit of a thorn in the side of the Americans, and also just happened to be like they have the largest oil reserves in the world. You know, I think their oil reserves are even more than Saudi Arabia. Like, the amount of oil that they've got down there is incredible. But then they didn't want to have a socialist government, and they were lending out money to Cuba and to Haiti, and the Haitian leaders ended up stealing the money. The post-Aristide Haitian leaders, there was a huge scandal because they basically pocketed all this money that the Venezuelan government had given them to help the people of Haiti, because they remembered when Bolivar was helped by the Haitian slave, you know, Haiti was the location of the site of this black slave revolt that led to their independence, and they were punished for that. And just as an aside, so then up until the 1940s or something, Haiti was paying reparations. The Haitian government was actually, it was for like 100 or 200 years, the government was paying money for reparations for that revolution to the French government. And then the Americans took over. And so the last payments made by the Haitian government for having the audacity to hold a revolution in the late 1700s, they were still paying for that, because what they did was they stole all this property that belonged to the slave owners. Well, what was the main property of the slave owners? It was the slaves. Slaves were the property, and they freed themselves from being property. And so then they had to pay. There was an economic embargo against them, this economic warfare against them, and then they paid for centuries for that, because they'd freed themselves, because they stole themselves. It's so bizarre. Anyway, so Freeland was one of the main leading lights of that Lima group, which is losing some of its
And these
credentials.
and these governments have nothing to do with communism. They're just all social democrats or or socialist reformist governments. Whether it was Aristide's Haiti, Hugo Chavez, and and Maduro's Venezuela, Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, right?
Yeah, there are definitely left-leaning governments there. Haiti had a lot of restrictions on it, but the Haitian people, that the reason that Haiti has been occupied for so long, and the reason that Canada and the US and France invaded and occupied Haiti in 2004 was because that population, those people are so politically aware. They are so politically savvy. Like different countries have an identity, right? So Canada has this identity, oh, we're the peace-loving, Canadian values of this and that and the other thing, which is a lot of hypocritical nonsense because we've been involved in every imperial war that ever Western imperial war that ever happened. But anyway, so the Haitian identity is, we freed ourselves from slavery, and we defeated imperialism and started our own independent state. We freed ourselves from being slaves. That's a major part of their identity. And they feel that over the centuries, they've been repressed and squashed by all these different American, death squads and all these horrible governments that have been imposed on them from the outside because they were this progressive revolutionary movement that freed themselves as slaves. They've been squished and squashed ever since. So that's their identity. And so they're very politically enlightened. And if you were to give those people freedom to elect whoever the heck they wanted, you would have a Cuba over there so fast, it would not be very long before, if they had proper elections that anybody could run in, they probably, it's very likely that they would have a very left-wing government. But
exactly, I completely agree with you. Well,
so you have to stop that.
Well, I have just some last questions.
Sure.
But then going back to going back to Stepan Bandera and these Eastern European groups. Now, what's your response to people who say that some of these people, like Bandera and similar movements led by him, yes, we can denounce their anti-Semitism, their Romophobia, and other crimes against humanity, but they only collaborated with the Nazis because they didn't want to be a colony of Russia, whether it was under the Tsar or the Bolshevik communists. What's your response to?
Actually, I couldn't hear. There was a part of your statement there, or your question, that I couldn't hear. You froze, the screen froze, and I couldn't hear anything for about half a minute.
Okay.
Sorry.
So yes, what's your response to people who say that people like Bandera and others, you can denounce their anti-Semitism, their Romophobia, and other crimes against humanity, but they only collaborated with the Nazis because they didn't want to be a colony of Russia, whether it was under the Tsar or the Bolshevik.
Oh, I see. Okay, right. Oh, okay. Well, a major part of their identity of those fascist organizations, led by Bandera and Melnik as well, and the other faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, they were quite happy. They were fascist organizations. How could you be selective about? They were anti-Semitic. They were fascist. They believed in extreme violent tactics. But you're saying that some people argue that, well, you can criticize them for that, but you can't criticize them for being anti-communist? Is that what you're saying?
Some people would say that.
Some people say that.
You're right. Some people would say that because some people would say, because some people would say that yes, you can denounce their anti-Semitism, but they only join the Nazis because because they wanted to free themselves from
Well, they whoever.
Soviet colonialism and
Yeah,
stuff.
right, right. Well, they didn't only join the Nazis for that. They saw eye to eye with the Nazis. They were both white supremacists. They were both really extremely anti-Jewish. They were both extremely anti-communist. You know, they were not terribly different from the Nazis. They were fascist organizations. So I think you have to.
Hence why they collaborated.
Yeah, I mean, but it wasn't just because, oh, gee, we have to collaborate with the Nazis. We really don't like them. We don't like their ideologies. We don't like Nazi beliefs. And no, they actually embraced all of these various different Nazi beliefs. The only thing different about them was that they wanted to have their own independent fascists. They wanted to lead their own independent fascist nation, and they were all for ethnic cleansing and wiping out the enemies. And so it wasn't as if they held their noses and worked with the Nazis. They were quite happy to work with the Nazis. Like, it wasn't a painful thing for them to do. They were quite happy, and they, you know, like I said, these people welcomed the Nazis with open arms when they came in. They saw them as a liberating force. Because the Soviets had been not terribly friendly with fascists who lived in their country. Like, can you imagine if, well, you're in Belgium, but let's say there was a whole group of Belgians hiding out, not even hiding, just there were all sorts of fascist Belgians there, like thousands of them. And then there's a fascist country next door, and the fascist country is going to invade you, and you've got all these fascists in your own country. What would you do? What a terrible situation to be in. I think there were human rights violations committed by the Soviets, because they found, like in the Baltic countries, several tens of thousands, I don't know how many, 25,000 or something, from the Baltics were deported, or not deported, but they were moved. They were moved away from their where they lived, and they were moved far away. Okay, but what these Baltic communities, in their narratives, in their stories about this horrible forced migration of their forebears, what they don't tell you is that happened about a week or 10 days before the Nazi invasion. The biggest mass forced movement of people out of the Baltics happened just before the Nazis invaded. And the Soviets, of course, knew, because they had intelligence operatives, and the files show this very clearly, is that the Soviets knew that an invasion was coming. They may not have known the exact day, but they knew that that the country was going to be invaded. And they had been expecting this ever since they signed that non-aggression pact. They used that time, it was about a year and a half, they signed that non-aggression pact because the British and the French would not go ally with them. Soviets had a big meeting in Moscow, and they invited France and Britain to send their top delegates. And they said, look, we want to form, the Soviets said, we want to form an alliance to fight against the Nazis, and we will put in these tens of thousands of planes and tanks and everything. We'll commit ourselves all this, and we want you to also commit to it, and let's stop these Nazis. And they refused. So then they had to sign
because again, just like Western support for the Spanish for the Spanish fascists. With World War II, it was again seeing communism as the greater evil as opposed to Nazism, right. Fascism.
Well, the West was quite happy to see the Nazis move over and attack the East, move east and attack the Soviets, and that was obvious what they were going to do. I mean, it was clear that was Hitler's biggest enemy. So it was no big surprise. So basically, when the Soviets signed that non-aggression pact, they were basically buying time. They knew that the Nazis were going to invade them. They didn't know when, but they knew it was going to come, and it did. About a year and a half later, the Nazis invaded, and the biggest military invasion of world history. It's bigger than any invasion that's happened before and has happened since. Like, it was just couple thousand miles of a front and just tens of thousands of planes and millions of soldiers, and attacked all in one day. It was in June 22nd or 23rd, of 41. And so they, just before that invasion happened, the Soviets rounded up all of these people who they figured were the ones that were collaborating with the Nazis, because all of those Baltic states and the other Eastern European countries had guerrilla movements in place, so that as soon as the Nazis invaded, these guys would spring into action and help the invasion, right? And so that's what happened. There were these thousands of people hiding out in the forest that had weapons. They were these armies, these little armies were armed and trained and financed and by the Nazis, by Nazi intelligence agencies. And they, so what are the Soviets going to do? They could see that their own people in their own country were going to support this invading force of Nazism, and that they had all these fascist Nazi collaborators in their own country. What are they going to do? Oh, it's a terrible situation. What would you do? What would they do in Belgium? What would they do in Canada? If we found that we had all these thousands of people hiding out in the forest with weapons, and that they were going to kill all the Jews and kill all the people of different ethnic communities, and the Nazis were going to invade, and what would we do? It would make sense that they would round them up and move them away. And I'm sure it would cause all sorts of human rights violations if you did that. But they were trying to prevent an even greater genocide from happening. So they moved these people, and then they were hoping that this would avert even worse crimes from happening. And in the end, 27 million Soviet citizens were killed by the Nazis. 27 million. What if they had just left all these fascists there to help the Nazis invade? Would it have been worse? Maybe they would have lost the war, and the Nazis would have won, and the Nazis would have taken over. Maybe, Anyway, sorry.
That's a perfect segue to this question. We're almost done. That's a perfect segue to this question, which is, what are some of the half-truths or legitimate grievances that some of these expat groups, these well-funded apologists, use to gaslight and keep people committed to their endless Cold Wars and hot wars with Russia? Because I know in your investigative series, I think probably the most controversial part of your series involves the Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine, which many in Ukraine and the anti-communist expat community say was a genocide. But you challenged this, so your response to that?
Well, it's there. The Holodomor. I mean, I haven't spent that much time studying it, but from my reading of different academics like Per Anders Rudling and others, the Swedish-American guy who actually studied in Edmonton, did his PhD there under Freeland's uncle, who was Chomiak, the Nazi propagandist's son-in-law.
Wow.
It's complicated, eh? Yeah. So anyway, he acknowledges that there was I think he was saying like maybe 3 million people died in the Holodomor. But they say that the number who died was in Ukraine was about 10 million. So what he says is that they really exaggerate the numbers of people that died. And the other thing is about this is that it's one thing for people to die in a famine, but it's another thing to round people up and put them into gas chambers and then flood insecticide gas into the gas chambers and just kill millions of people. It's different from a famine, which there were lots of people who died all across the Soviet Union, not just in Ukraine, but also in these other states within the Soviet Union. They died in all the different states. There were people dying here. There was the other thing is that it's often, I think it's a factor that shouldn't be ignored, is that there was a lot of resistance to the collectivization. The Soviets wanted to collectivize the farms. They thought that was their idea, was that if you had collective farms and that everybody was working together on big property, big farms, instead of having it divided into little parcels, and that the profits or the revenue, the wealth generated, the food generated from these farms would be actually, you could then disperse it more equally to more people if you had collective farms. That was their idea. So they tried to collectivize the farms. Maybe they tried to do it too fast. There was obviously resistance to that collectivization process that was going on. So the churches were main force within the resistance, and they did nonviolent direct actions to try to stop this collectivization. And one of the tactics that they used, and this is described in a book on the Holodomor by a guy named Robert Conquest, who wrote this big 1,000-page book on the Holodomor. And he was a really right-wing guy. He was British. He worked for the British intelligence for 15 years or so, and for that British intelligence propaganda, a organization that promoted anti-communist, was feeding anti-communist stories, misinformation and fabrications and different kinds of propaganda to labor leaders and political leaders and whatever. And that was their job, spreading disinformation. Anyway, but he did write this big, thick book about the Holodomor. And in that, Conquest documents the resistance campaign that was done by the Ukrainians, who were against collectivization. And what they did was they slaughtered millions of their cows, millions of their sheep, millions of their pigs and their goats, and then they also burned a lot of their stockpiles of food as a way of opposing this collectivization. It was like when the Nazis invaded, the Dutch people flooded the fields and dismantled the windmills and stuff, so that it sabotaged. It's a form of sabotage. But they sabotaged themselves. This Ukrainian anti-collectivization movement, led by these nationalists and the churches and whatnot, they sabotaged themselves because they literally, as Conquest documents, they killed millions and millions and millions of their own animals and their own. So that's their food source. And then the next year, this was in like 31, or something like that. So then the next year and the year after that, there's this huge drought, and they've just wiped out a lot of their food. So it's going to have an effect, like that is one factor that has to be taken into consideration, that these people sabotaged themselves because they were politically opposed.
So whatever one wants to say about Stalin, and yes, there were human rights abuses, there was repression in Stalin and whatever Soviet communist head of state, but this wasn't some genocidal, racist policy that he inflicted on Ukrainians. On Ukrainians. The collectivization program would have worked, but due to the resistance and the sabotage that you experience, that led
huge drought. The huge drought, the weather conditions. It was just a perfect storm of horrible things that happened. I'm sure there were, when you're trying to make such huge changes to society in ways that you think are actually going to help, I think that their motivations were to help society. If you look at the other things that the Soviets did, they had free education, free healthcare, like they socialized healthcare. We kind of think of that as a good thing here, right? Canada prides itself on socialized medicine. Well, the Soviets did that way before us, and it was Putin that brought it back. They lost their socialized healthcare when the Soviet Union was crushed, and around 1990, they lost their socialized healthcare. And it was Putin, when he came in for the first time, he actually brought the government-funded healthcare back.
I didn't know that, actually.
And the Americans still don't have that, right? They don't have They don't really have a proper system there. Or look what, anyway, so I think they were, maybe I'm naive, but I think that they were trying to make things better for their population. I think that was what they were trying to do. I don't know whether collectivization would have worked. It was never given a chance in there and in the 30s anyway. That horrible drought happened and millions of people died. There's no doubt about that. The extent to which the Soviet government can be blamed, I'm not sure what the extent of the blame is. I think you do have to take into consideration the sabotage that happened. That's another factor. But it's not the same as rounding people up or shooting them by the millions. Like millions of Jews were killed in the Ukraine just with guns. Like you just killed them. It was a Holocaust of bullets. Is what they call it, Holocaust of bullets, not a Holocaust in the gas chambers. But I mean, to round people up and put them in gas chambers, it's a rather different thing than you're trying to collectivize the farming. Then there's a drought, and they happen to have sabotaged themselves, and then people die. I mean, maybe there were, it's complicated, and but they're not equivalent. Just like saying that the Nazis and the communists are the same and they're both to blame equally for World War II, that's kind of the same as saying the Holocaust and the Holodomor are the same. They're equals. They're not the same. They're quite different. It's complicated. Anyway.
It's interesting. And three last questions because we're going way over time. So three last questions. This one, this one respond briefly so I can get to these last two important questions, which is
okay, I'll try to be quick.
Which is what role did or what role does the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation play back then and now in Eastern Europe? And even this group is also founded by Nazi war criminals and collaborators, right? The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, based in the U.S.
The U.S. equivalent of our monument. Yeah, it was created. I think George Bush Jr. inaugurated it. Who was the guy that was
was it Bush Senior, George H.W. Bush?
Oh, was it George Senior that did that? Okay. Yeah, it's been around for a lot longer than our monument's not built yet. But so the question is, what role did the monument play in?
What role has this foundation played back then and now in Eastern European affairs?
I'm going to pass on that question because I can't remember. Remember what the foundation did.
Okay, no problem. And actually, just to double check, I'm just looking at some notes here. It was founded in 1994, and yeah, it was founded in 1994, 93, 94. So,
okay.
One of the founders is Zebny. I'm definitely butchering his name, but Zebny Brzezinski.
Oh, right.
Former national security advisor to Carter, and then all around scumbag on top of that.
and he grew up in Montreal. His father was Brzezinski was the leader of the Polish Canadian Congress, I believe, and then the Brzezinski Jr. Zbigniew. I have a hard time pronouncing those names as well. Anyway, he grew up in Montreal and went to university in Montreal, then moved to the U.S. and eventually became Carter's security advisor, and he was the one that came up with the strategy of arming the fundamentalist guerrilla, these feudal mujahideen in Afghanistan in 79. But about 6 months before the Soviets sent troops in to intervene there, because there had been a change in government, and a left-wing government had come to power in Afghanistan, and they were trying to move things very quickly and letting women on TV and radio, and promoting them to all sorts of different jobs, and it was a socialist thing. It was very similar to the Contras in Nicaragua. They had a similar victory in Afghanistan, and it was just too much, and you did not want to have a socialist government anywhere. The Americans didn't want to have one, so here's another one that pops up, and so they had to stop it. So Brzezinski, his plan, what he did was he funded all of these fundamentalist terrorist organizations, and they went in and they were blowing up community centers and women's centers and schools and daycares and all that sort of thing, and sabotaging the socialist government. And then they were going to the Soviets and saying, come on, you got to help us. These guys are killing us here. The Americans are backing these guys, and they're like these feudal warlords. They're into the drug trade, and they're selling heroin, and they want to control their little areas, these drug lords. And you got to set, and the Soviets kept saying, no, it's going to be really bad if we do that. Like, world's going to hate us. They're going to, just be a horrible thing. We'd love to help, but we can't. But eventually they kept begging them. And then they finally said, okay, all right, we'll send some troops there. Well, then of course the whole West is like, oh, the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan. And so, they boycotted them at the Olympics.
Even in fact, even much of the left, popular left, also recycles a lot of the propaganda that, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and that's equally as bad as the American invasion of Vietnam. You have some that even argue that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, you can't blame the people in the peace movement and these progressive movements, in a way, because they're bombarded by propaganda in all of the newspapers, the TV, the radios. It's all telling them the same story, like the same
NGOs as well.
And so they're just as subject to the propaganda as anybody else. They read the newspapers, they watch TV, and they listen to the radio, and they, all the different state institutions are all pumping out the same narrative, the same story, the same anti-Soviet or anti-communist, anti-Russian propaganda. It's coming at everybody from every possible direction, right? And so it's really hard to be objective, because you're constantly getting the same story, one side of the story. You never hear the Soviet side of the story or the communist side of the story. That's not allowed. So people, in a way, you can't blame them for recycling what you say, recycling the propaganda and the lies, because they don't know any better. That's all they're exposed to. Now,
in fact, Richard, actually, I was just checking this victim of communism memorial fund in Washington D.C. It was completed in 2007, and indeed, George W. Bush did dedicate it to.
I think that he was there to unveil it, cut the ribbon or something.
Yeah.
And wasn't the main guy behind that was Mr. Dobriansky? Wasn't that the guy's name?
Let me.
And I think he was the one that started. He's the one that started Captive Nations Week. So the captive nations, that's the term that they used for Eastern European countries that were being, and nationalities, ethnic groups, they were these nations that were held captive by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was this evil prison state, and all of these countries were all captives, you see. So then they had this whole propaganda thing starting in the 1950s, so that every president since the 1950s has celebrated Captive Nations Week, and that involves issuing a statement about how great the United States is as a beacon of love and democracy and freedom around the world, promoting goodness and light and democracy and all these wonderful human rights and everything around the world. That's what the United States is doing. So you have to say that. Every US president since the 50s has said that, including Obama. And then on the other hand, you have to say, and then counter to us, there are these poor captive nations that are held by these evil dictators, and we are doing our best to free the world for democracy and to help these poor captive nations. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, those were the uh, Soviet captives, captives of the Soviet Union, and so it was quite a big propaganda offensive, promoting American exceptionalism around the world and American imperialism, and of course, never saying anything about the American, genocide against First Nations, or killing millions of people in Vietnam, or millions of people in Korea, or 1 million people in Indonesia, which had the third largest communist party in the world until the CIA went over there and overthrew them and put in a dictatorship, or Guatemala in 1954, when the socialist government that was elected there was overthrown, and the United Fruit Company, when the Dulles brothers, who were in charge of the CIA and the foreign secretaries in the United States, how they benefited from helping to overthrow that democratically elected socialist leaning. It wasn't even a communist country. They were just sort of, they were standing up for their own rights and their own ability to use the wealth in their own country for themselves, not have it stolen from them by these foreign US companies. Same thing happened in Iran in 1953 with Mossadegh. He nationalized the oil industry, which was owned by the British, and the Americans and the British helped overthrow him. He was a democratically elected, socialist-leaning guy who had to be removed and overthrown. The list of all of these wonderful places, and then they have Captive Nations Week, but they never talk about all these brutal military dictatorships around the world, like some of the ones that I just mentioned, or in South Vietnam or Taiwan, or these horrible places where the militaries were running the place for decades and killing thousands, tens of thousands, in Guatemala, I don't know, several 100,000 people killed under these brutal military dictatorships, one after the other, where the U.S. is arming them and Canada's helping.
And in fact, that's a perfect segue to my second to last question, which is
full of questions.
So my second to last question I wanted to ask you is what similarities or distinctions do you see in Canada and its allies weaponizing expat immigrant groups like what you uncovered with these Eastern European organizations? And is it the same with the Cuban exiles of Miami and other parts of the U.S., the Venezuelan expat communities, and the Syrian Middle East expat communities that we see who support the right-wing backed oligarchs opposition in Venezuelan in Venezuela, who support the ongoing economic terrorism of Cuba, as well as the efforts to oust Assad and supporting reactionary Islamist groups, as well as do you see a lot of similarities between the Eastern European groups you've uncovered, supported by the West, as well as the Cuban exiles, the Venezuelan expat groups, and the Uyghur rights organizations?
Well, I'm not an expert on everything or anything really. I just sort of, I've uncovered some things, but I don't know about everything that you're asking me. But yeah, there definitely are patterns between those groups. Like any kind of right-wing anti-communist people that are fleeing their country are going to be much more likely to get welcomed into Canada. Ever since the for 100 years or more, the Canadian government has been had policies that are restricting immigration and selecting who they bring in, and they want to bring in people that are going to support the government. They don't want to bring in rabble-rousing people that might cause trouble for the Canadian government, right? So they're going to bring in whoever is most likely to be helpful to the Canadian economy, filling in whatever professions we need to have filled in. And they're going to want to bring in political people whose politics are in tune with the mainstream elites, liberal, conservative, power elites in the country. So that, you know, if when after the Vietnam War, there were people fleeing from, they didn't want to be part of a communist country, so lots of people fled from there, and well, Canada opened its arms to them, just like we opened our arms to the East Europeans who were fleeing the communism in Eastern Europe, and like the other countries you mentioned, like the Cuban expats. There's a lot of them in Florida, right? Of course, so it's the same sort of thing. And then they become kind of hotbeds for, like with the Cuban community in Miami, it's kind of was a hotbed, probably still is, for people that are trying to subvert the government in Cuba, and even doing terrorist activities in collaboration with the CIA, you know, bringing all sorts of you know, different viruses, even biological warfare, into Cuba. And this is pretty well documented now. Or trying to assassinate, or try even in the invasion, right? The Bay of Pigs invasion. These were, a lot of them were émigré communities. The Cuban emigres in Florida.
With ties to organized crime as well, right?
Ties to organized crime, sure. Yeah, and then there's the whole Contragate thing. When I became politically active in the 80s, that was what the big thing was. It was in the news all the time. So maybe that influenced me. You know, the whole Contragate thing was happening, and you know, the CIA was being exposed for a lot of the. I mean, it did the exposure that they got. The wasn't in the mainstream wasn't complete. It was sort of a limited hangout. They would expose a certain amount, but then cover up a lot of the other stuff. But anyway, it was. Those were times when it was common commonly in the newspapers to see critical things about the CIA and their involvement in this or that, the other thing with the drug. The reason I thought of that was because the drug trade, you know, criminal activities. So they were bringing tons of cocaine up into the United States, and then weapons were going down south to arm these terrorists in Nicaragua that were trying to fight the socialists there, right? The socialist government, the Sandinista government. So then,
and now you know, and now we see, you know, some, you know, these Nicaraguans who are leaving their country because Daniel Ortega, you know, is supposedly you know, this communist dictator, or this authoritarian left dictator, and we see the same, you know, that same patterns of these people who claim that they're fleeing this oppressive government, but they're but they're supporting the most reactionary elements to try to. I mean, it's crazy. You know, it's really crazy, and you know, you know, I noticed, when reading your series, that there is a huge similarity between, you know, the Cuban expat communities, these Venezuelan expat communities, as well as, you know, Syrian and more broadly Middle Eastern, North African expat communities, who are all saying we need to overthrow Gaddafi, we need to overthrow Assad, we need to support moderate rebels, and of course they always end up being non-existent moderate rebels, and it just ends up propping the most reactionary forces within, within the region. And you know, you mentioned Afghanistan. That was also the same thing. I mean, all of those, you know, groups that were saying to people to support the Mujahideen, I mean, they were all, you know, Islamo-fascists. They were all, you know, reactionary Islamist movements.
Yeah, I remember back in those when like in the around 1980, and there was a lot of support from progressive groups, you know, for the arming the Mujahideen, and I knew enough to know that. Yeah, sure, but progressive people, like professors that I had, American professors, that were supporting the whole idea that, and it was in the media, like the media was supporting it. Now, a few years later, it comes out, you know, Bin Laden, and not the nicest guy around, and he was a CIA guy, but early on, there were there were a lot of people that were supporting, they were sympathetic to these fundamentalist drug lord terrorists. Well, they didn't know that's what they were, but that's what they were told by the media, that they were these, we needed to help support them because they were fighting against the evil Soviets. And Brzezinski, who we talked about earlier, the Polish guy whose dad was the head of the Canadian Polish Congress in Montreal, he said, well, they asked him later, he did an interview in some French magazine or something, and they said, well, what do you think about what you armed all these fundamentalist Muslims that ended up being a big problem? And he said, what do I care about a few riled up Muslims? Our main goal was to destroy the Soviet Union, and that's what we did. It was a big part in our anti-communist goal of destroying the Soviet Union. And what do I care if there's some riled up Muslims? It was basically what he said.
We're seeing the same thing with the support of the of these Uyghur rights groups and the narrative that there is a genocide going on in China. When the moment you start digging into the World Uyghur Congress and where all of these Uyghur rights groups are getting their money from, it's from the National Endowment of Plutocracy. I'm sorry, the National Endowment of Democracy.
Democracy.
And all of these, Canadian deep state and other Western deep state agents, and it's just unbelievable. Same with the Hong Kong protests. They all are, most of them are all, funded to the teeth by the National Endowment of Democracy and Canadian groups, and it's just scandalous, and it's just incredible how even left-leaning folks, fall for this propaganda, and then I think my final question.
Oh no, not another one.
Well, and then final question. Although you sort of already answered it. You actually already answered this, but just have to ask it again, which is how is it that these these Eastern European expat groups get away with people either ignoring or overlooking all of these Nazi skeletons in their closets? I can sort of understand how the first generation can ignore it because they were the ones that founded these groups. They were the ones who support these fascist movements. But then, how do you explain others who left the Soviet Union, or who left any of the East, or who left any of the Eastern blocs? Some claim that they left because of political persecution. Others who simply thought that they could make a better life in the West, and then they join these expat groups with these seemingly benign names, and yeah, how can they fall for it? Like with the how do they fall for it? Is it like do they just want to become so much part of a community of people from Ukraine or Czechoslovakia or Poland? So they join these organizations, and the people just don't tell them about about the people that they're lionizing, or like how does that happen?
Because I really believe that the people that you can't say that just because you belong to one of these organizations, just because you glorify these people who are documented Nazi collaborators, that were perpetrators of the Holocaust, or who were promoted ethnic cleansing, stuff like that. You actually promote these guys as heroes. How can somebody do that? And that's a complicated question, complicated answer. I think that if you, I mean, it has to do with your knowledge about history. So if your knowledge of history is restricted to one narrative, one story, and you've never read anything else besides that, and you kind of, all these different authority figures in your life are telling you, here are the facts, you know, A, B, C, D, E, and F, and it's coming to you from your church, it's coming to you from your political leaders, it's coming to you from your ethnic community leaders, it's coming to you through newspapers of your ethnic community, it's coming to you from the mainstream newspapers, TV, radio, and it's coming to you from your schools. You know, it's coming at you from every possible angle, from your family, from your, you know, community. You're inundated with this one story. Then if you hear a different version of history from some other source, which you don't really know, and you can't be sure to trust it because everybody else is saying that X is the case. Someone comes along and says, hey, actually it's Y, you know, then you just shun it, and you go, you know, sometimes you'll just ignore it because it doesn't make sense. There's a whole theory about science, right? Scientific theories and how they change. Like, was it Karl Popper came up with this analysis of how scientific truths change. You know, it can change from being the Earth is the center of the universe to the sun is the center of the universe, of not the universe, but the solar system. So how does that kind of a change happen? It's the same sort of thing with a political analysis of history. It has to do with the exposure to information. And at first you'll ignore those little facts that can pop up. You go, oh, that can't be true, I'll just ignore that. But then if it keeps coming at you, then you go, oh, that's just propaganda. That's Russian propaganda. That's what they often say. Like when Freeland, it came out that Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi, the chief Ukrainian Nazi news propagandist during World War II. Then she and her community and her family and her friends, they basically just said, this is an example of Russian propaganda, and they are trying to subvert and undermine our Canadian democracy by attacking one of our leaders. And as if Freeland in any possible way can be blamed for her grandfather. Of course she can't be blamed for what her grandfather did, but they never still, the media has still not printed a single story that I'm aware of showing that she herself wrote for the same right-wing Nazi collaborating, promoting, glorifying publications that her grandfather did. These organizations and publications that were you know, whitewashing the Holocaust and whitewashing their forebears' involvement in war crimes and in collaborating with the Nazis. So she herself, it's nothing. She shouldn't be criticized for what her grandfather did, and I certainly have never criticized her for what her grandfather did. She can't blame her for that. And lots of people, look at Germany. There's a lot of people in Germany. I think they've done a pretty good job at coming to terms with their Nazi past. You know, I think it took a while, but I think most Germans are very aware of that horrible history and acknowledge it. And you know, there are books written by people who found out that their grandfather was a Nazi collaborator, high up in the Nazi thing, and then they just go, my God, I was so shocked, and it was so horrible, you know, and like, but that process has not happened here to the same extent at all. Like, people have been able to ignore and deny that history because their communities and the media and the government and all these institutions have been so in tune with each other that they all present the same narrative, and then they immediately discount anybody who, or any stories that come up that present a different understanding of what happened in history and the facts of history. So I think it's good on, but basically maybe the best way to end this, my view of this thing, is that good, honest, decent people who really mean well can do all sorts of horrible things and believe in all sorts of lies and misinformation and deceptions. They can do horrible things, and they can believe in ridiculous things, even though they're good, honest, decent people. But it's just a matter of projecting onto them a kind of a narrative, a story, an understanding of themselves, of who they are, of who their group is and their identity. And if you can control the narrative of your group, and then you can get people to do things that they normally would not do. Because I really believe that people are basically good people. I don't think people are intrinsically evil or bad, or want to do. Like, there are psychopaths and people that do, that are willing to do horrendous crimes and murders and stuff like that. Most people cannot do that. It's really hard to get soldiers to kill other people. You have to go through rigorous training to get people into a frame of mind where they are willing to go and kill other people. So, and it's similar in that getting people to believe lies and mistruths and misunderstanding, it's not an easy process. You really have to be very good at it. And also, finally, the best propagandists are the ones who really believe it. It's not that they're spreading lies. They really believe the stuff that they're spreading. They honestly really believe it. So does that mean they get off the hook? You can't blame them because, hey, they're just, they're all duped and brainwashed, and so they get a free ticket out of jail. To a certain point, yes, you can, a child or somebody, if they're been told all this information and they've never had any other exposure to the truth, any exposure to anything else besides the one narrative that they hear, then you can't really blame them. But at some point, you have to hold people responsible that if they never look into it, because the information is all out there, if they were only to take the time to look into it for themselves and make a serious evaluation of what really happened, then I think that these people would not be so trapped and held captive and enslaved by their ideologies. I think people are basically capable of we have to hope that people are capable of change. Anyway, so that's there's the font of wisdom from me for now, I guess. I tried.
Well, that's I think that's a perfect place, and I'm not going to
no more questions.
Yeah, I'm not going to do another follow-up question. Otherwise, it's otherwise it's probably going to be too long. But anywho,
or you're going to fall asleep.
Anyway, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Richard Sanders of the Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade. Brilliant journalist, historian, peace activist, NGO critic, and media critic. His work has really helped decolonize my mind on all things Eastern, on all things Eastern Europe, NATO, and whatnot. And Richard, you also have a petition which I'm going to post.
Right.
Which I'm going to post underneath.
Right.
Which I'm going to post in the pinned comment sections. To get people to demand that Canada stop supporting groups and stop lionizing these groups that lionize Nazi war criminals and collaborators.
To stop funding these organizations that glorify Nazi collaborators.
I'll make sure to post that and the links to and the links to that. I really hope that we have you back on the future. Keep up with the brilliant work you do.
Oh, thanks.
And I look forward to hopefully having you back on in the future. All right.
Okay, thanks very much, and I really appreciate your having me on here, and having had this little soapbox to spread my views on things.
It
Thanks
was
very much.
wonderful. It was wonderful, and it was an honor. And I'll
Oh,
also close and I'll also close by saying, Glenn Ford, when he was alive, the executive editor of Black Agenda Reports, he was talking, in a wonderful speech of his, he was talking about, just like how Obama and Clinton supported Islamic jihadis in Syria, Obama supported Nazi militias in Ukraine. And I'm talking about real Nazis, real white Nazis with swastikas and doing the salute. And in fact, Ukraine right now is the #1 place for Nazi tourism. That is Nazis
oh
go there
yeah.
to be amongst their kind, and
Wow.
go there to be amongst their kind, and people who are interested in Nazis go there just to see what Nazis look like. So
Right, and they can go there and join a mass march of like 10,000 people that with lots of Nazi flags and banners promoting fascists and whatnot. Yeah, you can get into big torchlight parades and have all sorts. If you're, yeah, I never thought about that. Yeah, that's true. Nazi tourists, eh? Nazi
So,
tourism.
thank you so much for thoroughly thoroughly exposing these groups, and I only hope that anyone who watches this and examines the links, yeah, decolonizes their minds, and we really need to do it, and we really need to
Yeah,
end
thanks.
these Cold Wars and whatnots. Uh-oh. And I think we've just lost Richard, so I'll talk to everyone later.